The first time the committee tried to stop my solar install, it wasn't with a vote, or a letter, or even a warning. It was with a timer. A glossy orange stop work order taped to my balcony door, stamped in thick black ink, 48 hours, no exceptions. The kind of thing that makes your stomach drop even if you've done nothing wrong. The kind of thing that makes you stare at the ocean for a second longer than usual, like the water might explain how your home turned into a battleground overnight. I live on the 10th floor of Seabreeze Tower, a coastal condo building that looks pretty from a distance, white stucco, blue glass railings, palm-lined walkway, the whole postcard deal. At sunrise, the light slices across the balconies like a slow golden wave. At night, the surf below is a low, steady hush, like a giant breathing in the dark. It's the exact kind of place people buy into for calm. And it's exactly the kind of place where calm gets weaponized by the wrong people. Because this wasn't really about panels. Not at first. It never is. It was about control. About a small set of board members who had grown addicted to deciding what community standards meant, even when those standards didn't make sense in reality. I'd seen their petty power games before, parking warnings for visitors who stayed 10 minutes too long, balcony plant violations for pots that weren't the approved shade of charcoal. But I honestly thought the solar plan would be different. It was clean, quiet, and pretty much invisible from the street. I figured I'd get a routine approval, maybe a mild lecture about aesthetics, and then I could keep paying my electric bill without feeling like I was feeding a machine. Instead, I got a countdown. The installer had already been on my balcony once that week, sliding the sleek black panels into place, double-checking the brackets, and laying the wiring in clean lines. It took maybe an hour, tops. They packed up, left no mess, and were supposed to come back Friday to finish the inverter tie-in. Friday was the whole point. Friday was when the system would actually turn on. Friday was when I could stop watching my utility statement inflate like a beach ball. Thursday evening, right after sunset, I found the stop work order. 48 hours. No installer allowed on property. A $900 fine if violated. Policy 11B, highlighted in yellow. My name typed in the blank like someone had been waiting to write it. What happens when her installer returns during the 48-hour stop order? That question sat in my head like a pebble in a shoe. Every step I took inside my own condo, I felt it grinding. Because I knew exactly why the order was there. And I knew exactly who pushed it through. Her name wasn't Karen, but she might as well have been carved from the same block. I'll call her Ms. D, retired, mid-60s, always perfectly pressed, always on the balcony at the most inconvenient moments, like a security camera with a fancy scarf. She lived 2 floors below me, and she'd turned complaining into a lifestyle. When she didn't have rules to enforce, she invented concerns. When she didn't have concerns, she invented emergencies. She was a one-woman alarm system for other people's choices. The thing about Ms. D is she didn't even need to dislike you to come after you. She just needed to notice you. If your routine was different from hers, it triggered something in her like an itch. She'd already had words with me about my balcony lights being too bright after 10, even though they were warm string lights with a timer. She'd sent me a note about my doormat apparently not matching the building's coastal palette. She'd once called security because she thought my friend's laughter on my balcony sounded disruptive. That was my first hint that Seabreeze Tower could be an HOA nightmare if the wrong person got a whiff of authority. When I asked the front desk about the stop order, the concierge shrugged in that nervous, apologetic way people do when they're stuck between common sense and policy. The committee had signed it, he said. He couldn't undo it. The security team had been told to deny access to my installer if they showed up. It was already logged. So I went back upstairs with the orange paper in my hand, shut my door, and stared at the most peaceful view in the city. The ocean looked so normal, so unfairly indifferent. The sunset had smeared the horizon purple and copper. A gull drifted across the glass like nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. And in that moment, I decided I wasn't going to lose Friday. Not because I loved conflict. I don't. I'm the kind of person who will hold a door open for someone who just cut me off in the parking lot. I'd rather step around a problem than wrestle it. But I've learned that if you live under a board long enough, stepping around turns into shrinking. And if you shrink long enough, they stop seeing you as a neighbor and start seeing you as a blank space to control. This was my condo. My balcony. My bill. My sunlight. And it was about time I reminded the building that ownership meant something. I moved into Seabreeze Tower 3 years ago. Back then, the association felt like background noise, quarterly emails, annual budget summaries, the occasional reminder to keep patio furniture tidy during hurricane season. I picked the place for the view and the walkable beach access, and because the building was newer, built with big windows that let in a ridiculous amount of daylight. My job is remote, so I spend most mornings at my dining table with coffee and a laptop, watching the water change moods. At first, the board seemed straightforward. A president who kept meetings short. A treasurer who liked spreadsheets and calm voices. A vague architectural committee that approved paint colors and patio shades. I barely thought about them. I paid dues on time, kept my unit sharp, waved at neighbors in the elevator. Easy. Then, about a year in, the board changed. Seabreeze had always had a rule about uniform exterior appearance. Most buildings do. But the way that rule is used depends on who's holding it. The new president, Mr. K, was a former project manager who treated the association like a corporate department. He wasn't mean in a loud way, he was mean in a "I'm doing this for your own good" way. The kind of person who would smile while turning a screw tighter than it needed to be. He spoke in bullet points. He loved committees. He loved the word compliance. Ms. D wasn't on the board officially, but she might as well have been shadow elected. She camped every meeting. She took notes like she was being graded. She sidled up to members afterward, whispering concerns, planting fears. If Mr. K was the engine, she was the fuel. Within months, everyone felt it. Small stuff started appearing. Notices about patio umbrellas being off-tone. Warnings for leaving shoes outside doors for even an hour. A new, quiet hours reinforcement policy that let security knock if they suspected disturbance, which was basically a permission slip for anyone with a grudge to send a uniform to your door. I tried to stay out of it. I kept my head down, did my thing. But it's hard to stay invisible in a glass tower. Friday morning, I woke up before my alarm. The sky outside was pale, the ocean flat like a sheet of steel, and the air had that cool hush it gets right before the beach fills up. I made coffee I barely tasted and opened my laptop with a focus that felt sharp enough to cut glass. First, I sent the management office a detailed email. Not emotional. Not ranty. Just structured. I attached the approval. I cited the date the 30-day window expired. I included screenshots of the committee's responses. I asked, point blank, what specific clause justified a stop work order after approval had already been granted. I list the potential cost of delaying the final tie-in. I ended by saying I expected clarity within the day, because the installer was scheduled. Then I went a step further. Seabreeze Tower sits in a state with a solar access statute. I'd heard about it years ago but never needed it. It basically protects a homeowner's right to install solar, barring reasonable safety and structural concerns. It doesn't mean an HOA can't regulate aesthetics, but it does mean they can't ban systems outright in a way that makes them ineffective. I wasn't about to waltz around calling it a lawsuit or anything. That would be dumb and not my goal. But I wanted to know where I stood. So I pulled up the statute, read it line by line, and wrote a clean summary for myself. I noted the parts about unreasonable restrictions and timely review. I compared them to Policy 11B. I highlighted any overlap. No threats, just awareness. That was evidence prop number 1, a printed copy of Policy 11B with my annotations, sitting next to a note that said, approval by default after 30 days. I wanted a clear trail if anyone tried rewriting history. By 9 a.m., I still had no reply. The installer's ETA was noon. The stop work order timer still had hours left. I started pacing. The sound of neighbors' footsteps in the hallway felt louder than usual. Somewhere below, a leaf blower whined to life, and gulls argued over something loud and desperate. I sat at my table again and opened the association's portal, looking for any new posts. That's when I saw it, a fresh Architectural Committee bulletin, uploaded late Thursday night. I clicked. The bulletin claimed the committee had paused all balcony solar installations pending a safety and aesthetic review. It cited resident concerns about glare and structural risk. It said no new solar work could proceed without an updated policy. It didn't mention me by name, but the timing was a neon sign. The whole thing was aimed straight at my unit. And there it was, tucked into the bottom paragraph like a knife under a napkin: any violators would be subject to a $900 fine per occurrence. They were trying to flip the board game while I was already on the board. My hands got cold. Not from fear, exactly. From that specific flavor of anger that comes when someone changes a rule just to stop you, and pretends it's for everyone's safety. A normal move would have been to comply. Wait for the review. Hope it turned out fair. But I'd been watching Seabreeze too long to trust that. Reviews like that didn't end in open discussion. They ended in quiet bands shaped like guidelines. So I called the management office. No one picked up. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. That's when I realized they were dodging me on purpose. The bulletin was probably already circulating in board circles. They wanted me to see it, panic, and cancel. They wanted to win without ever having to argue. I stared at the ocean again for a second. The sun was higher now, slanting bright through the glass. My panels outside were already catching light, silent and patient, like they didn't know they were controversial. At 10:30, I got a text from the installer saying they were on schedule, on their way. I didn't reply right away. I looked at the orange stop work order again, then at the bulletin on my screen. 2 pieces of paper trying to decide my Friday. And I thought about what Ms. D wanted. She wanted me to fold. She wanted to be able to tell herself she saved the building. She wanted to tell the board she'd been right to be alarmed. She wanted the association to learn that her complaints could reverse approvals, even after the fact. That's not something you let live once it's born. So I replied to the installer with a simple update: I had documentation. I expected them to show up as planned. I said I'd handle security and committee issues if they came up. Then I did something else that felt small but mattered. I knocked on 2 doors on my floor, my neighbor across the hall and the couple at the corner unit. I didn't ask them to fight for me. I just told them what was happening, and asked if they'd noticed any glare or issues. Both looked genuinely confused. One laughed and said the panels were barely noticeable. The other said she'd been thinking about solar herself. She asked why the board was suddenly anti-solar if they'd approved mine. I didn't say Miss D's name. I didn't need to. I went back inside, opened a fresh doc, and drafted a short, polite message to the whole building. Just a neutral update explaining that I had received approval under Policy 11B, that a new bulletin had paused installations after my work began, and that I wanted clarity. I included a screenshot of the approval email and the bulletin state. I asked anyone concerned to contact me directly so I could address specifics. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't dramatic. But it did one important thing. It pulled the conflict out of the shadows. Boards like Seabreeze count on residents staying isolated. If you think you're the only person being targeted, you act like you're a problem. If you realize the board is bending rules to suit one loud complainant, the spell breaks. By 11:45, my email was sent to the community list. At 12:05, the installer arrived. Security stopped them at the lobby with the stop work order in hand. I took the elevator down, papers tucked under my arm like a shield. The lobby was bright, a few residents sipping smoothies by the mail wall. The surf was louder near the opening doors, and I could smell fresh salt in the air. I walked up to security, calm on the outside and boiling on the inside. I handed them my approval. I showed them the portal confirmation that my request had been filed and auto-approved by default before any bulletin existed. I pointed to the bulletin's timestamp. I asked them to explain, in policy terms, why an approved job could be halted halfway through based on a retroactive pause. The guard looked uneasy. He wasn't a villain. He was just a guy trying to follow the latest paper. He told me he couldn't allow access unless management cleared it. Management still wasn't answering. So there we were, standing in the lobby in front of half the building, with my installer waiting and my stop work order ticking down. I felt eyes on me. Not hostile eyes. Curious eyes. The kind of attention that makes you choose between shrinking and standing tall. I chose tall. I told security that if management wouldn't respond, I'd document that refusal. I promised I'd take full responsibility for the install being within my approved scope. I asked them to log that I had presented approval documents and that management was unreachable. I kept my voice steady. I kept my words clean. I watched the guard write in his little logbook. And then I heard the elevator ding behind me. I didn't turn right away. I already knew that sound. Smooth, deliberate steps on tile. A breath that felt too close to my back. Ms. D had arrived. The stopwork timer might have been a deadline, but the real clock was social. If she made a scene right here, in this lobby, she could shame the building into siding with her before the committee even answered. I stayed facing security while she hovered in my peripheral vision like a storm cloud. I could practically feel her leaning into the moment, ready to perform. But I didn't give her the stage. I held my papers in one hand and my phone in the other, already recording my own calm summary for my records. I asked security one last time to call the manager. I said I'd wait 5 minutes. I said if there was still no contact, I would proceed with a written notice to the committee that the delay was unreasonable based on Policy 11B and state solar access protections. 5 minutes passed. No manager. No committee. Just the quiet hum of lobby air conditioning and the ocean breathing outside. I turned to the installer, nodded once, and told them we'd regroup upstairs while I filed the notice. If the board wanted to stop me, they were going to have to do it on record. We rode the elevator up in tense silence. I could feel Ms. D's eyes drilling into the back of my head as the doors closed. The elevator's soft music sounded almost mocking against my pulse. Back in my condo, I looked at my balcony panels glowing in the noon sun. I had a choice now, back off, or push forward into a full collision with the association. I opened my laptop and started drafting the notice I'd promised. Clear timeline. Clear documents. Clear references. And one quiet line at the end: any further enforcement without specific policy basis would be considered harassment. I wasn't bluffing. I was building a trail. Outside, the wind picked up a little, rattling balcony railings like impatient fingers. Somewhere below, a door slammed. The building was awake now. The conflict had oxygen. And I could feel something shifting, like Seabreeze Tower had finally realized this wasn't just about my balcony. It was about whether one retired neighbor and a stubborn committee could rewrite reality whenever they felt like it. I hit save on the notice and stared at the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Friday wasn't lost yet. But it was about to get loud. The notice I drafted wasn't a dramatic manifesto. It was a timeline. It was me refusing to let anyone pretend the last month hadn't happened. I laid out the dates the committee ignored me, the moment default approval kicked in, and the exact time stamp on their shiny new bulletin. I attached everything in a tight little bundle like a gift they didn't want to open. Then I sent it to the manager, the board president, the architectural committee inbox, and the general association email. While the emails whooshed away, I stood by my sliding door and watched sunlight pour over my balcony. The panels looked almost serene, like they were built to be ignored. Seabreeze Tower had always made a show of branding itself as future-facing coastal living. We had brochures about sustainability in the lobby, a recycling room that smelled like lemon cleaner, and a rooftop garden that existed mostly so the board could brag about it in newsletters. Yet the minute someone actually tried to make their unit more efficient, they reacted like I'd thrown a bike rack through the window. The worst part was realizing the bulletin wasn't even a review yet. It was a pause disguised as inevitability. Everyone in this building knew that once a pause went up, you didn't unpause without a fight. The committee would study metrics for months. They'd hold a special meeting at a time no one could attend. They'd add a rule so overly strict that solar might as well be banned. Then they'd call it compromise. I couldn't let that happen quietly. So I did two things at once. I kept my paperwork moving, and I started studying the building's culture the way people study the tide. Who was frustrated with the board? Who had tried to install something and been blocked? Who was already talking about solar in their own private chats? The first email reply came in around 1:30 p.m. It wasn't from the board. It was from a neighbor I barely knew, a guy on the 7th floor who signed his name with just an initial. He said he'd seen my message. He said the board had denied his solar request last year without explanation and he'd still had the screenshots. He offered to forward them if I needed proof of a pattern. That was the first crack. Another message followed from a woman in a corner unit on the south side. She'd been fined for balcony planters because the committee claimed the pots were too visible from the pool, which was a hilarious reach considering we were 10 stories up. She wrote that she admired how I was handling this and asked if I wanted support at the next meeting. More cracks. By late afternoon, my inbox had turned into a quiet confession booth. People weren't just annoyed about solar. They were tired of the association turning appearance into a leash. They were tired of getting scolded for living. They were tired of watching the same 3 board members and their unofficial sidekick decide what an entire tower could or couldn't do. I made a list in my notebook, not of allies, but of shared grievances. Parking warnings, pet policy threats, improper doormats, a random crackdown on balcony furniture last winter. The association had built a record of nitpicking that was bigger than any one project. Solar was just the spark. Around 4 p.m., the manager finally replied. Her tone was cautious, almost rehearsed. She said the committee had received multiple safety complaints and was obligated to investigate. She reminded me that the bulletin was effective immediately. She urged me not to allow contractors on property until the review concluded. There it was again. Effective immediately. I read her email twice and noticed what wasn't there. She never said my approval was revoked. She never said there was a specific violation. She never cited a clause allowing retroactive pauses on existing approvals. She just leaned on vague authority. So I replied, politely, and asked for the exact policy basis. I said I'd already provided evidence that my install was approved before the bulletin. I asked whether the committee intended to rescind an approved improvement without due process. I asked for a date certain when the review would be completed. I ended with one neutral, deadly sentence: I would not accept ongoing delay without written justification. Then I waited. Friday evening arrived without a clear answer. The ocean had turned choppy, the wind louder against the glass, and I could hear kids laughing down on the beach like the whole world was still normal. I tried to relax, but my brain kept replaying the lobby scene. The stop order timer was almost done now, but I could tell the association wanted to win through exhaustion, not through timing. When I went to bed, my panels sat half-installed like a paused movie. The system couldn't be activated until the inverter tie-in, which meant my balcony was basically a billboard reading unfinished. I hated it. I could feel Ms. D savoring that little visual. The next morning, Saturday, I woke up to a fresh post in the portal. Special board session, solar safety review. Monday at 6 p.m. lobby conference room. Resident statements limited to 2 minutes. I laughed once, sharp and humorless. They'd scheduled it the minute after most people got home from work, with a 2-minute limit. Tight, controlled, easy to steamroll. They were about to learn I could talk fast. If they pushed this to a formal stop on Monday, the legal fallout wouldn't be abstract anymore, it would land on my unit first. Sunday became preparation day. The sunrise was hazy, the air thick with that damp coastal warmth, and the gulls outside were extra relentless, like they could smell tension. I brewed coffee, opened my folder, and started building what I privately called my boring hammer. Step 1, I compiled the timeline into a 1-page summary. No drama, no adjectives. Just dates and facts. The default approval window. The actual approval email. The install start date. The bulletin's upload time. The stop work order. The manager's vague response. If the board tried to muddy something, I could point to a clean record. Step 2. I printed excerpts from the CCRs that defined limited common elements and owner improvement rights. I highlighted the clause that said balconies were under individual unit control for standard fixtures and improvements. I cross-referenced it to Policy 11BS, Good Faith Consideration, line. I stapled it all. Step 3. I went back to the Solar Access Statute. I copied the relevant part that said associations couldn't impose restrictions that significantly increase cost or decrease efficiency. The key phrase for me wasn't a threat, it was a reminder that the association didn't get to pretend solar was a novelty they could swat away. Evidence prop number 2 slid into place here, a screenshot of the board agenda for Monday's session, which conveniently listed the complaint sources as resident reports submitted by Ms. D. The agenda didn't name her directly in the body, but the attachments did. She'd filed 3 separate reports in 48 hours, each more dramatic than the last. One claimed, potential fire hazard. Another implied loose panels could detach in storms. The third suggested glare could endanger drivers on the coastal highway, which was honestly impressive in its imagination. I printed that agenda excerpt and tucked it into my folder. Not to embarrass her publicly, but to show intent. A pause wasn't community-driven if it was triggered by one person's obsession. Sunday afternoon, I walked the hallways and talked to anyone I'd emailed with. Quiet, respectful, not a rally. I asked if they'd be willing to attend Monday and speak briefly about their own experiences with board delays. I didn't script anyone. I just asked for honesty. By evening, I had at least 8 people committed. Not a mob. A witness list. Monday came fast. The morning was bright, the surf steady, and Seabreeze Tower wore its vacation glow like nothing had been simmering underneath. I put on a simple outfit that said resident, not rebel. I packed my folder, my notebook, and a backup battery for my phone. I wasn't planning to record the meeting for anyone else. I just wanted my own notes and timestamps. At 5:55 p.m., I walked into the lobby conference room. The space was cold from overactive air conditioning, and the fluorescent lights made everything look slightly too sharp. The board sat at a long table up front like a panel of judges. Mr. K in the middle, leaning into his laptop. The treasurer to his right, eyes down. 2 committee members on either side, already looking tired. At the back, a handful of residents filled the fold-out chairs. Ms. D was there, front row, clutching a leather notebook, posture tall with that special kind of righteousness that makes a person look like they've already won. I breathed in once. Slow. Salt air still clung faintly to me from outside. Mr. K opened with a speech about safety and harmony. He said the committee had been made aware of solar activity. He said the board needed to ensure building-wide standards. He said the pause was temporary and responsible. I noticed he never said my name. Then he invited resident statements. The first speaker was the 7th floor guy who'd emailed me. He described his own ignored application, short and clear. He said delays like this discouraged sustainability in the building. He asked for a policy timeline. Then another neighbor stood and spoke about being fined for a minor balcony change that the previous board had allowed. She said the association had become inconsistent and punitive. 2 minutes, exactly, and she sat down. I could see Mr. K stiffen slightly. The statements were lining up into a pattern he didn't want to acknowledge. When it was my turn, I stood and walked to the little microphone on a stand that always felt like overkill for a condo meeting. The carpet under my feet was slightly rough, and I could hear the ocean faintly through the hallway window like a steady reminder of the bigger world outside this room. I didn't attack. I didn't rant. I just laid out the timeline from my 1-page sheet. I said I applied properly, waited past the approval window, received approval, began installation, and then received a stop work order after the board posted a new bulletin. I asked what policy allowed retroactive enforcement, and I asked for an official deadline for the review. I held up my annotated Policy 11B excerpt and cited the good faith language. I pointed out the panels were below the railing line and not visible from the street. I said there was no structural penetration of common exterior. I watched faces shift in the room. Some residents nodded. Mr. K's mouth tightened. Ms. D raised her hand like she was in a courtroom. Mr. K called on her. She launched into a speech about danger, about storms, about the look of the building, about how allowing my panels would open the door to chaos. She didn't reference any actual engineering or data. She referenced feelings, framed as facts. The air felt colder while she talked, like the AC had sensed the heat of her tone and tried to cancel it. Then she said something that made my pulse spike. She claimed I never had approval. I looked right at my folder. Mr. K glanced down at his laptop, then up at me, then back at her. The treasurer whispered something to him. He raised a hand for calm and said the board had indeed issued an approval, but that approvals could be reconsidered if new safety information was presented. That was the pivot. He was openly admitting they intended to revoke it. I asked him, within my 2-minute window, what safety information had been presented by a certified professional. He didn't answer directly. He said the committee would consult experts. I asked for a timeline again. He said, as soon as feasible. Residents murmured. The room felt like a kettle starting to hiss. Then Ms. D stood and tried to pass out printed photos of my balcony, taken from below, zoomed and grainy, like evidence in a surveillance file. She said the panels were visible from the pool deck. The irony is that they were barely above the railing line and the photos were clearly taken with a ridiculous zoom. But she held them up like trophy proof. That's when I realized something important. She wasn't trying to convince me. She was trying to scare everyone else. Because once fear spreads, boards don't need policy. They just need momentum. Mr. K ended resident statements right on the 2-minute timer as if it was a game show buzzer. He moved straight into committee discussion. The board members leaned into their laptops and the agenda like they didn't want to meet anyone's eyes. They discussed potential glare, storm risk, and consistency. They talked in circles without saying the thing out loud. They wanted a pretext to ban balcony solar without looking anti-sustainability. They kept using the word temporary, like temporary was a magic spell that erased consequences. I listened and took notes. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, and my pen scratched paper in little sharp lines. Finally, Mr. K announced a decision. The pause would remain in place. Installations could not proceed building-wide until the committee finished its review. Any existing partially completed installations, including mine, would remain inactive. They'd reach out to external consultants. They expected a recommendation within 60 to 90 days. 60 to 90. That was their temporary. My system would be dead in the water for 3 months. My installer would reschedule at a cost. My panels would sit there like a taunt. And in the meantime, they could draft a rule to make future installs impossible. I felt my throat go tight, but not with panic. With clarity. I stood and asked, calmly, on record, whether the board intended to compensate me for delay costs caused by a retroactive pause. Mr. K said compensation wasn't within their scope. I asked whether my approval was officially rescinded. He said it was suspended pending review. Suspended. Not rescinded. Not denied. Words mattered. I nodded like I accepted it, but inside I was already planning. When the meeting ended, residents spilled into the lobby in clusters. The air outside the conference room felt warmer, and the ocean breeze drifting through the doors made the building smell alive again. People approached me quietly to say they were on my side. One man said his daughter worked in renewable energy and could connect me with someone who knew building codes. A woman said she'd be happy to sign a petition if I organized one. Ms. D walked past me without looking up, her notebook clutched like a medal. Mr. K didn't talk to me directly. He just packed up and left. I returned to my condo that night with the sort of calm that comes after someone officially declares war on you. I sat at my dining table and opened my laptop. I replayed the meeting in my mind, not emotionally, but structurally. What had they said that could be used later? What did they avoid saying? What timeline did they commit to, even vaguely? I wrote it all down. Then I did something I'd learned from watching board games in other buildings. I requested the official meeting minutes and the consultant's scope in writing. I asked for a copy of the safety concerns that justified the pause. I asked for the criteria by which installs would be evaluated. I asked whether any other resident had filed complaints besides Ms. D. Not because I expected them to answer quickly. Because every request forced them to leave footprints. Tuesday, the building felt different. Maybe it was just me noticing, but elevator rides were a little quieter. Neighbors glanced at my folder when I carried it to the mailroom. Someone in the gym whispered, "That's her," in a tone that wasn't mean, just curious. Social ripples were spreading. That's when the association did what it always does when it feels a situation slipping. It escalated. Wednesday morning, I found a certified letter taped to my door. Final notice of violation. It said my installation was in progress without active authorization. It ordered me to remove the panels within 10 days or face daily fines, plus possible legal enforcement. It cited the new bulletin and referenced suspension authority under Policy 11B. It included the $900 fine line again, like a hammer they couldn't wait to drop. Evidence prop number 3 appeared here, the final notice dated Monday night, right after the meeting, with a timestamp proving they'd drafted it in advance. They weren't reacting. They were preloading punishment. I stared at it for a full minute, the paper crinkling slightly in my hand. The ocean outside was loud, a steady crash like background drums. This was the board trying to force a retreat. They knew my approval wasn't technically rescinded. So they were trying to corner me into removing voluntarily before their review ended. If I removed the panels, they could claim the pause caused no harm. They could write whatever rule they wanted later. Ms. D would do a victory lap. I wasn't doing their cleanup for free. I scanned the notice, saved it, and logged the date. Then I wrote a reply in the same factual tone I'd used before. I stated my approval was issued prior to the bulletin. I stated the bulletin did not contain a revocation clause. I stated that ordering removal without due process contradicted Policy 11B's good faith review requirement. I requested clarification within 5 business days. Then I sent a separate, shorter email to the community list, advising everyone that the board was issuing removal orders to existing installations despite prior approvals, and that residents should monitor the process closely. I didn't name names. I didn't accuse. I just shared facts. The association wanted a one-on-one fight. I kept making it building-wide. If they succeeded in slapping a $900 fine on me now, it wouldn't stop at solar, it would teach them they could monetize any pause forever. The next few days were a blur of petty pressure. Not overt harassment, not anything a board would admit to, just the slow drip of inconvenience that makes you second-guess your own resolve. Security started randomly checking contractor IDs on my floor, even though no contractors were coming. The elevator near my unit suddenly had a maintenance sign on it for half a day, funneling traffic past Ms. D's balcony line. The management office stopped responding to my emails entirely. Even the package room staff got a little stiff with me, like the association had whispered that I was trouble. And still, the panels stayed on my balcony, silent and incomplete. On Saturday, I ran into Ms. D in the lobby. She held her chin the way people do when they're waiting for you to apologize. I didn't. I smiled politely and stepped to the side so she could pass. She paused like she wanted a confrontation, but because I wasn't giving one, she moved on. That moment told me everything. She needed emotion to feed this. She needed me to be the villain in her story. If I stayed calm and boring, her narrative couldn't land. So I stayed calm and boring in public. In private, I started organizing. By the second week after the meeting, I had enough residents frustrated and enough receipts to form a petition. Seabreeze Tower has a clause allowing owners to request a special meeting or policy reconsideration if a certain percentage signs. It's meant to be a pressure valve for exactly this kind of power drift. The board rarely likes when people use it, which is why people forget it exists. I didn't forget. I drafted a short petition demanding the board finalize solar policy within 30 days, allow existing approved installs to complete, and include at least 2 resident volunteers in the review committee. Reasonable. Specific. Hard to paint as chaos. I walked it floor by floor. Residents signed faster than I expected. Some had been waiting for a reason to push back. Some were just angry about their own experiences. Some didn't even care about solar but hated how the board had handled it. A few told me they felt like they were living in a condo version of HOA versus homeowner drama, where the association always assumed it was right just because it was loud. By Thursday, I had 30 signatures. I needed 42. That might not sound like much, but in a building where people avoid conflict like seagulls avoid quiet, it was huge. Mr. K must have felt the current shifting because Friday morning, I received an email from the board. They said they'd reconsidered the timetable. They'd now aim to complete the review in 4 to 6 weeks, instead of 90 days. They said I could keep my panels in place but could not activate the system. They said any further contractor visits would require a separate security escort. They offered no apology. They offered no policy basis for the final notice. Just a slightly shorter leash. I read it and felt that odd mix of satisfaction and annoyance. They were bending because they felt heat, not because they understood. This was the association testing how much pressure would make me settle. I didn't settle. I replied that I appreciated the updated timetable, but that my approval should not be suspended retroactively, and that I expected the contractor access to be restored to complete an already approved installation. I noted that requiring security escorts for a normal balcony job was an unreasonable restriction that increased cost and delayed efficiency. Again, not a threat. A breadcrumb. I also attached a photo of my signed petition in a neat stack. I didn't even mention I was 2 floors away from the signature threshold. I just let the weight of paper speak for itself. They didn't respond to that. Instead, the next Monday, they posted a draft of updated solar guidance on the portal. The draft was exactly what you'd expect from a board that wants to ban something without saying ban. It required panels to be non-visible from any angle, which is basically impossible in a tower. It required owners to carry additional insurance beyond normal coverage. It required an engineering review paid by the owner. It capped panel size so low it would barely power a desk lamp. And it included a new clause giving the board 60 days to respond to any solar request instead of 30. A ban in everything but name. I forwarded it to the residents who'd signed my petition already. Their replies were immediate and irritated. One person wrote back that the board was basically telling owners solar was allowed only if it didn't work. I knew then that the next meeting couldn't be a quiet one. The board scheduled a follow-up open session for the next Thursday at 6 p.m. They framed it as a community feedback night. It sounded friendly if you didn't know the association's playbook. Friendly nights are where boards drain dissent into a 2-minute comment pool and then walk away unchanged. I wasn't walking away. Thursday arrived with heavy clouds rolling off the water. The air smelled like rain and salt, and the sky had that bruised gray look that makes palm fronds whip harder than usual. The lobby conference room filled more than last time. Not packed, but crowded enough to rattle the board's calm. Mr. K opened again with safety language. He pointed to the draft like it was a generous compromise. He said the committee had done extensive research, which was funny because he hadn't cited a single professional yet. Resident statements started. A man near the back said he worked in construction and the visibility requirement made no engineering sense. A woman said the insurance mandate was a cash gate. Another neighbor said the response window change violated our CCR protections. The treasurer fidgeted. One committee member looked like he wished he were anywhere else. When my turn came, I stood and held up the petition stack. I stated that I'd gathered signatures from a substantial portion of the building requesting a fair solar policy and a firm timeline. I placed the stack on the front table, not aggressively, just clearly. I reminded the board that Policy 11B required good faith consideration, and that restrictions could not be so strict as to make solar useless. I didn't read the statute aloud. I didn't need to. It was a line in the sand, not a weapon. I also asked a simple question: had the board consulted any certified solar engineer or building safety expert, or were they relying solely on resident complaints? Mr. K hesitated. He said they were in the process of consulting. I asked who. He wouldn't say. The room murmured again. That's when Ms. D sighed loud enough for half the room to hear. She stood and started saying that I was pushing a personal agenda and that one person's panels become everyone's problem. She waved a hand toward the windows like the ocean itself was on her side. I kept my face neutral. The more she performed, the more obvious her motivation became to everyone else. A resident on the 9th floor quietly pointed out that Seabreeze marketed itself as green. Another said the board had no issue approving glass windbreak panels last year, which were far more visible than solar. A third asked why the association wasn't exploring rooftop shared solar if they truly cared about safety and aesthetics. The board looked cornered by the logic. So Mr. K did what cornered boards do. He ended statements early. He said the committee would take all comments under advisement, and that a final policy would be published within 2 weeks. He said the pause would remain until that policy was in place. Then he adjourned. People lingered afterward in the lobby, frustrated. The rain started tapping on the glass doors, soft at first, then harder, like a drummer warming up. I didn't rage. I didn't beg. I just collected names and emails from residents who wanted to stay involved. By the time I rode the elevator back up, I had more than 42 signatures. Threshold met. The next morning, I sent the formal special meeting request to management, attaching the petition and citing the CCR clause that required the board to schedule a resident-driven session within 30 days. They couldn't dodge that without openly violating their own rules. Management replied 2 days later with a date: the special meeting would be held in 3 weeks on a Wednesday evening. That felt like a win, but not a finish. Because in the meantime, my balcony still had dead panels. My installer was still paused. And the board still had time to draft a final policy that made this special meeting a ceremonial venting session. So I shifted from defensive paperwork to offensive planning. The board approved my balcony solar, then froze it retroactively after Ms. D flooded them with complaints. I gathered residents, built a petition, and forced a special meeting to challenge their draft rule. With the special meeting clock started, the board's vibe changed. Emails arrived faster. Portal posts popped up more often. The association was suddenly very eager to look transparent when it had been hiding behind silence for weeks. They published their final solar policy 10 days before the special meeting. It was better. Not good, but better. They dropped the non-visible from any angle nonsense and replaced it with not visible from street level, which was basically my original condition. They reduced the insurance requirement to a simple proof of contractor coverage. They still demanded a third-party engineering sign-off for any balcony install, paid by the owner, but they at least offered a list of pre-approved engineers at a lower fee. They kept the 30-day response window. It was a compromise they hadn't wanted to give. And I knew why they gave it. Because the petition had teeth. But the policy still included a clause stating that any approvals issued before the pause would remain suspended until reviewed under the new standards. That clause was aimed at me. They were trying to be fair to the future while still punishing the present. So I drafted my strategy for the special meeting. I wasn't going to scream about how unfair it felt. I was going to show how unfair it was, structurally. I pulled meeting minutes from the last year and highlighted any instances of retroactive enforcement. I mapped the timeline of my approval against the bulletin. I collected residents' email testimonials about delays and inconsistent standards. I also called my installer and asked for a cost breakdown of the delay. Not dramatic, just practical. How much would rescheduling cost? How much efficiency loss would the new engineering requirement add if my existing install had to be redone? He emailed me a neat estimate. I printed it. Money talks when boards pretend not to hear. At this point, the building had split into quiet camps. Most residents didn't care deeply about solar, but they cared about fairness. They didn't like the idea that approvals could be yanked midstream because one neighbor got loud. The only people truly aligned with Ms. D were a couple of older residents who'd been board adjacent for years and liked a tight ship. But even they were starting to wobble. The association had made a mess big enough for everyone to smell. 3 days before the special meeting, I got a surprise knock. It was the treasurer. He stood outside my door looking uncomfortable, like he'd rehearsed this conversation in a mirror and still hated it. He said the board wanted to offer me a resolution. They would allow my install to complete under my original approval if I signed a waiver agreeing to comply with the new policy for any future modifications. They also wanted me to stop organizing residents against the board. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a request to put toothpaste back in a tube. I thanked him for coming by. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. Because his visit told me something bigger. The board was scared. They weren't scared of solar, they were scared of precedent. If I won publicly, other residents would realize they had tools. Petitions. Special meetings. Recall votes. The entire board ecosystem depends on residents assuming they're powerless. I wasn't about to trade that moment for a quiet personal exemption. But I also wasn't about to dismiss a chance to get my system activated. So I took the offer apart in my head like a puzzle. What did I want most? Friday energy savings, sure. But bigger than that, I wanted the clause about retroactive suspensions gone. Not just for me, for anyone who got approved and then punished because the board changed its mind. I wrote the treasurer a careful email that night. I said I appreciated the offer, but I couldn't accept a private resolution while the policy still allowed retroactive enforcement for others. I said I'd be open to a true compromise if the board amended that clause before the special meeting or agreed to voluntarily grandfather existing approvals without extra engineering hurdles. I hit send. Then I waited in a different way than before. Not anxious waiting. Strategic waiting. Letting them decide whether to be reasonable or to dig deeper. The ocean that night was louder than usual, wind-driven, waves slapping the seawall with a wet, rhythmic insistence. It felt like the whole coast was leaning in. Special meeting in 3 days. If they didn't amend that clause, I was ready to make the building see exactly what kind of board it had allowed to grow. They still had a deadline to fix the retroactive clause, and I could feel the clock speeding up. The day before the special meeting, the board posted an addendum to the solar policy. One sentence. Approvals issued prior to the pause shall be honored under their original terms, provided installations meet basic safety criteria. No extra engineering review. No reapplication. No suspended limbo. I stared at the screen for a second, rain streaking the window behind me, and felt a slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't joy exactly. It was that satisfying, grounded feeling you get when you realize consistency just got dragged back into the room. They'd caved on the clause. Not because they suddenly loved solar. Because they had to. Within an hour, I got an email from management saying my installer could return the next morning to complete activation, with standard check-in only. No escort, no extra hoops. Just normal process, like this whole mess had never happened. I called the installer immediately and confirmed. I could hear his surprise through the phone even without him saying anything. When I hung up, I walked out onto my balcony. The air was cool and damp, and the clouds were breaking in thin strips over the horizon. The panels sat there dark and slick from a misty breeze, waiting. I ran a hand along one edge. It felt solid, calm, real. Tomorrow, they'd turn on. But as satisfying as that was, I didn't feel done. Because the special meeting was still happening in 2 days, and now it wasn't about solar. It was about how Seabreeze Tower was governed. The board had proven that pressure worked. That resident tools mattered. That one loud neighbor didn't automatically get to steer the ship. I wasn't going to cancel the meeting just because my unit got a fix. That would have turned everything into a selfish win and left everyone else in the same fog. So I sent a message to the residents who'd signed the petition. I told them the board had amended the clause and my install would proceed. I thanked them. I said the special meeting could now focus on broader enforcement transparency and resident participation in policy drafting. I asked them to still attend, because this momentum was bigger than one balcony. Replies came back fast. People were excited. Some were shocked the board had moved at all. Others said this was the first time they'd felt like the building belonged to residents, not just a committee. The next morning, my installer returned. This time security waved him through with barely a blink. The job took 40 minutes. A quiet hum, a clean tie-in, a green light on the inverter that lit up like a tiny sunrise. When the system went live, my phone app pinged. Power flowing. Sunlight turning into numbers I could finally use. The ocean outside was bright again, and the wind had calmed, like even the weather was fine with the outcome. But the real payoff was still ahead. Because Ms. D wasn't going to accept this quietly. And the board wasn't going to forget that I'd shown residents how to push back. The special meeting would be the next arena. And I was walking into it with my panels glowing behind me, a petition's worth of neighbors beside me, and a board that had just learned the hard way that my patience had limits. When the addendum went up, the building exhaled in a way you could almost hear. It wasn't loud. It was the soft loosening you feel when a room realizes the bully has to follow the same rules as everyone else. I could sense it in the elevator chatter, in the way people smiled at me in the hallway like we'd shared a secret victory. Even the concierge looked lighter, like he wasn't bracing for another complaint call every hour. But that relief didn't erase what had happened. A board doesn't get to stall, suspend, threaten removal, and then pretend a one-sentence policy tweak makes it all fine. A neighbor doesn't get to flood the committee with dramatic reports and then vanish into the wallpaper once they lose. Seabreeze Tower had a deeper problem than solar. It had a power imbalance that had been growing in the dark. That's what the special meeting was supposed to address. The petition wasn't only about panels. It was about how the association used process as a weapon. I wasn't about to let the board reframe the whole thing as, "We listened, it's resolved, move on." Not when half the building had receipts of their own. So I kept preparing, even though my system was live now. That might sound petty or stubborn, but I saw it as finishing what we started. If I let this slide because my personal issue was fixed, that would tell the board the easiest way to neutralize resident pressure was to toss a single exception to the loudest organizer and keep the machine running the same way. I didn't want a private win. I wanted a structural reset. Over the next day, I organized the agenda for the special meeting with a small group of residents who'd helped gather signatures. No rehearsed speeches. No chanting. Just clarity. We agreed on 3 asks. 1. Enforcement transparency. Whenever the board issues a pause, suspension, or fine, they must cite a specific clause and a timeline for resolution. 2. Resident participation. Policy drafts that affect unit-level improvements should include at least 2 volunteer owners as part of the review process. 3. Complaint accountability. If a pause is triggered by repeated complaints from a single resident, the committee must disclose that concentration so the building understands the context. None of that was radical. It was basic governance hygiene. I also printed a short packet for anyone who wanted it, just the timeline, the final notice dated Monday night, the meeting agenda attachment showing complaint sources, and the revised addendum. It wasn't meant to embarrass anyone. It was meant to prevent gaslighting. People tend to doubt their own memory once a board speaks with authority. Paper keeps memory honest. On Tuesday evening, I taped a note to my own door reminding myself to stay calm. I know how I get once adrenaline hits. I can go quiet in a way that feels like surrender, or I can go sharp in a way that feels like cruelty. Neither helps. Calm is my best weapon because it makes other people's chaos look like what it is. That night, the ocean was glossy in the moonlight, and the wind made a low whistle around the balcony rails. My panels were already pulling a steady trickle of power even at dusk, a quiet reminder that the sun doesn't care about committee moods. Still, I didn't sleep much. Because I knew Ms. D wasn't done. Not with me, not with the building, not with the idea that she deserved to be right. And when someone like her loses a public fight, they don't walk away. They look for a different angle. The board had already made money part of this mess, and if they tried to claw back fines or fees now, it could cost me and everyone else real cash. The angle showed up Wednesday morning in the portal, a new compliance reconciliation notice. It was framed as a housekeeping update. The association said it would be conducting a review of all exterior modifications installed within the last 12 months to ensure consistency with current policy. They called it routine. They called it fairness. They called it the natural next step after updating solar guidance. I scrolled, and my stomach tightened. Because the notice included a separate fee schedule for retroactive engineering verification on any balcony solar system that had been installed or approved prior to the new policy. Owners would need to pay for a board-selected engineer to inspect their setup, even if it had already been approved. The fee was listed as $450 per unit. There were only 3 balcony solar systems in the building: mine, a quiet guy on the 6th floor who'd installed small panels last year, and a woman on the 12th floor who'd had roof share brackets approved but never activated because the board delayed her into exhaustion. This wasn't about safety consistency. This was a cash jab aimed at the tiny group that had challenged the board. They were trying to recoup their loss by charging us for verification, then using those inspections as another chance to nitpick and freeze systems again. It was a clean little revenge move, disguised as administration. I read the notice twice, then pulled up Policy 11B and our CCRs. There was nothing that let them impose new approval costs retroactively on existing systems. Inspections could be required for future installs, sure, but retroactive fees had to be voted on specifically, not slipped into a reconciliation memo. This was a shakedown dressed in professional language. I emailed the board asking what clause allowed the verification fee for already approved and functioning systems. I asked whether the fee had been voted on in an open session. I asked for the meeting date where residents could review or challenge it. I also wrote to the other 2 solar owners and asked if they'd seen it. Both had, and both were furious in that quiet, contained way that tells you someone has been patient for a long time and just ran out. We agreed to approach it as a group. By late afternoon, a few residents who didn't even have solar were emailing me about the notice. They weren't worried about inspections, they were worried about precedent. If the board could add retroactive fees now, it could add them to anything. Windows. Balcony shades. Even doorknobs if they wanted. That's how momentum spreads. Not by convincing everyone to care about your thing, but by showing them how your thing reveals the board's habits. So I added the verification fee to our special meeting agenda. I didn't tell anyone to freak out about it. I just presented it as a question of authority and fairness. People hate being nickeled and dimed by a process they can't see. Thursday evening, I got a reply from Mr. K. It was polite but clipped. He said the engineering verification was a safety necessity under the new policy. He said all exterior improvements were subject to review for compliance with updated standards. He said the fee was reasonable and proportional. He didn't cite a clause. He didn't say when it was voted on. He didn't address retroactivity. In other words, he replied like someone who still thought residents would accept his tone as proof. I forwarded his email to my resident group and asked one simple question: did anyone remember a vote on this fee? No one did. Because there hadn't been one. That night, I updated my packet again, adding the compliance notice and Mr. K's reply. I printed a clean summary of the fee issue and the lack of cited authority. The special meeting was in 5 days. And the board had just handed us fresh proof that they couldn't stop themselves from grabbing for control, even when the building had already shown teeth. The days leading up felt like waiting for a storm. The weather was doing its own dramatic thing too: humid mornings, fast-moving clouds, a sea breeze that flipped from soft to sharp without warning. People in the elevator talked about the meeting in short bursts like they were testing how safe it felt to say anything out loud. Ms. D, meanwhile, was suddenly everywhere. She started hanging around the lobby in the mornings, talking quietly with board-adjacent residents. She was back to her scouting position on her balcony anytime someone walked past below. She took to posting polite-sounding comments in the community portal about preserving Seabreeze's charm. She was trying to rebuild her narrative before the special meeting aired it out. I didn't respond to her posts. I didn't trade passive-aggressive notes. I let her perform into the air. But I watched the pattern. She wasn't seeking harmony. She was seeking allies for a counter-push. She probably knew the board had already conceded too much in her eyes. People like her don't forgive boards for backing down. They expect loyalty. She'd lost her solar war, so she was finding a different war to win. On Saturday, I found out what that war was. A letter slid under my door while I was out grabbing coffee. It wasn't from the board. It wasn't official. It was typed on plain paper with no signature. It said I was disturbing the community with aggressive behavior and that residents valued peace over personal agendas. It urged me to drop the special meeting and stop stirring division. No name. No specifics. No real accusation you could answer. Just social pressure. And I knew exactly where it had come from. Ms. D's favorite tactic wasn't policy. It was shame. If she couldn't win on paper, she'd try to isolate me emotionally. She wanted me to feel like the nuisance, not her. She wanted me to walk into the special meeting looking defensive and jittery, so she could paint herself as the calm guardian of peace. I didn't let it land. I took a photo of the letter, logged it, and tossed it in my folder without another thought. If anything, it confirmed that the meeting mattered. You don't threaten to stop something unless you're scared of what it could reveal. I spent the rest of Saturday going over my notes, trimming anything that sounded too personal, too heated. I focused on questions and citations. I rehearsed my key points in my head while the sound of waves rolled up through my open window like steady applause. Sunday night, I checked my solar app for the week's numbers. My system had already shaved a noticeable chunk off my usage. Not because I was riding some eco-high, but because sunlight is sunlight, and my balcony was finally allowed to use it. It felt like a quiet victory humming in the background. But I didn't forget that it only happened because residents pushed. Boards hate that lesson. They hate the idea that their authority depends on consent. So I knew they'd walk into Monday ready to reassert dominance. The special meeting was at 6 p.m. in the same lobby conference room. Same table. Same fluorescent buzz. The only difference was the room would be fuller, and the agenda would be forced by residents, not curated by the board. I got there early. The room smelled faintly like dry erase markers and recycled air. The ocean breeze hadn't reached inside, so everything felt a little sealed. Chairs filled quickly. I counted at least 30 residents, which was huge for Seabreeze. I saw both of the other solar owners sitting near the middle, calm but alert. I saw the woman from the 12th floor who'd been delayed last year, arms crossed, expression hard. I also saw Ms. D in the front row again, chin lifted, notebook ready. Mr. K walked in last with the treasurer and 2 committee members. He looked like he'd slept badly. He set his laptop down and glanced at the crowd, then at me, then at his agenda. He opened the meeting with a statement about respectful discourse and community unity. His voice was smooth, but he was sweating the room. You can tell when someone's used to small audiences and suddenly sees a crowd. Then he invited resident agenda items. That was my cue. With this many people watching, if the board tried to dismiss us, it would backfire into public embarrassment they couldn't control. I stood and kept my voice steady. I thanked the board for amending the retroactive solar suspension clause and for allowing my install to complete. I did that on purpose. Starting with acknowledgement disarmed the "she's just angry" narrative. Then I pivoted. I brought up the compliance reconciliation notice and the $450 verification fee. I asked where it had been voted on. I asked what clause authorized retroactive costs on approved systems. I asked why the notice was published without a timeline for resident review. The room went quiet in that tense way silence does when people are waiting to see if authority will finally have to answer to logic. Mr. K pulled a face that tried to look neutral. He said the fee had been recommended by the architectural committee and was therefore within their discretion. I asked, calmly, whether committee recommendations override the CCR requirement for open fee votes. I cited the clause number. I held up the text. He paused. He looked to the treasurer. The treasurer cleared his throat and said the fee had not been formally voted on yet and would be placed on the next open session agenda. That was it. A forced confession. Residents murmured. Not angry screams, just that collective sound of people recognizing a line had been crossed. Mr. K nodded stiffly like he'd planned that admission, which was cute. I then asked whether the board would suspend the fee until that vote. The treasurer said yes, pending resident input. Another small win, for the building. Next, I brought up enforcement transparency. I said that pauses and stop work orders should not be issued after approvals without citing exact policy basis and a firm timeline. I referenced my timeline as an example but said this applied to any future situation. A resident behind me added that he'd received a temporary freeze on balcony shades last winter for no stated reason, and it had dragged on for months. Another said she'd been fined for a plant rule that didn't exist until after she bought the plants. But he called on her anyway. She launched into another speech about preserving charm and preventing chaos. She said residents were being misled by one person's agenda again. She implied that sustainability talk was a cover for selfishness. She described herself as protecting everyone from a slippery slope. The mistake she made was talking as if the room belonged to her. Because halfway through, someone in the back politely asked her whether she had any professional evidence that balcony solar under the revised policy posed a safety risk, or if her concerns were personal preference. She didn't answer the question. She talked around it. A few residents exchanged looks. Someone sighed. Her performance fell flat, not because anyone hated her, but because the building had finally seen the difference between evidence and anxiety. That was the shift I'd been hoping for. Not humiliation. Clarity. Now it was time for the real move. I introduced the third agenda item, resident participation in policy reviews. I proposed a standing volunteer panel of owners that would join the architectural committee when drafting rules affecting unit-level improvements. Not to override safety. Just to add perspective and accountability. I had a list of volunteers ready, including an engineer resident, a retired city planner, and a couple of long-term owners who cared about aesthetics but also fairness. The room responded immediately. Heads nodding. Quiet approval. The treasurer looked relieved. One committee member actually smiled. Mr. K looked boxed in again. He said he'd consider the proposal. I asked if he'd commit to a trial period starting with the next policy draft. I asked for a vote. Board meetings are funny. They love to vote on tiny things when it suits them, but when a vote would lock them into transparency, suddenly everything needs further evaluation. This time, though, he couldn't dodge. Not with 30 residents watching. So he agreed to a 3-month trial of a resident volunteer panel, with sign-ups opening immediately. The room did that soft cheer thing people do when they don't want to be rowdy but are still thrilled. It felt like a gate opening. Then we moved to complaint accountability. I didn't mention Ms. D by name. I didn't need to. I just suggested that when a rule change or pause is triggered by concentrated complaints from one source, the committee should disclose that pattern so residents understand whether there's broad concern or a single anxiety-driving behavior. Mr. K stiffened, because he knew what I was pointing at. Ms. D stiffened even harder. He said complaints are confidential. I said sources can remain confidential while patterns are disclosed. I said it protects both residents and the board from misinterpretation. The treasurer nodded slowly. He understood. A committee can be led by legitimate concerns or by the loudest person in the room, and the building deserves to know which it is. They agreed to add a complaint concentration note to future bulletins. It was a small but powerful policy tweak. Ms. D's cheeks flushed. I could see it even from the table. It wasn't rage. It was shock. She was used to being a hidden lever. The meeting just installed a lock on that lever. And I realized the climax wasn't going to be some dramatic mic drop. The climax was this, Seabreeze Tower choosing process over panic. The meeting drifted into some minor side items after that, but the core was done. By 7:30, the room had shifted in a way it hadn't in years. People were exchanging numbers. They were talking about volunteering. They were talking about reviewing other policies. The board was still in place, but its posture had changed from ruler to servant, at least for now. And Ms. D? She left early, notebook tucked tight, shoulders rigid. I watched her go without triumph. Just a quiet, settled feeling that her era of unchecked influence had ended. The day after the special meeting, the board posted official minutes with every commitment listed clearly. They also posted a retraction of the verification fee notice, promising any future fee changes would go through open vote. Volunteer panel sign-ups went live. Within hours, the list had more names than slots. The building's energy was different in a way that felt earned. Elevators were warmer. Neighbors were chatty. Even the rooftop garden had more people in it, like folks were suddenly less afraid to occupy their own space. I'd like to say the board was suddenly reformed and considerate. They weren't. But they were restrained. And restraint is half the battle in a place where rules can be used like nets. Ms. D didn't file another complaint about my solar panels. She still watched from her balcony sometimes, but her stare had turned from hunting to sulking. One afternoon I passed her in the hallway and she looked through me like I was scenery. I let her. I didn't need her approval. I didn't need her acknowledgement. I just needed her to stop running the building through fear. The treasurer emailed me a few days later to say the board had scheduled a training session on solar standards with an outside expert. Not to scold residents, just to set clear guidelines for future apps. If that had happened from the start, we would have avoided this entire mess. I replied that I appreciated the step and hoped they'd apply the same diligence to other policies too. Things didn't magically become perfect. There were still rules and friction and the normal condo stuff. But people now knew how to push when something felt wrong. The petition clause wasn't a myth anymore. The board knew residents read policy now. And I could feel Mr. K's power loosen. He wasn't cornered yet, but he was on notice. A president who learns residents can organize tends to either calm down or burn out. The funniest part was how quickly Seabreeze started leaning into solar in its marketing again. 2 weeks later, the lobby newsletter had a little blurb about embracing innovative energy solutions and celebrating resident sustainability. It had a photo of the building at sunset with an artsy glow. No mention of the war that made that blurb possible. That's fine. Let them save face. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about a boundary. On my end, the panels did what panels do. Every day, they quietly cut my electricity use. My summer bills were down. The app made me weirdly happy with its boring charts. Standing out on my balcony with the sun on the railing and the ocean rolling beneath felt like reclaiming something simple, the right to improve my home without being treated like a threat. The theme through all of it, if I had to put words on it, was autonomy. A community should protect shared spaces, not control private lives. Boards forget that when they get too comfortable. We reminded them. Tell me your HOA horror in one line, especially if it involved temporary rules. Next week, I'll tell you about the time our board tried to ban a mailbox style mid-month and sparked a hallway war no one saw coming. I introduced the third agenda item, resident participation in policy reviews. I proposed a standing volunteer panel of owners that would join the architectural committee when drafting rules affecting unit-level improvements. Not to override safety. Just to add perspective and accountability. I had a list of volunteers ready, including an engineer resident, a retired city planner, and a couple of long-term owners who cared about aesthetics but also fairness. The room responded immediately. Heads nodding. Quiet approval. The treasurer looked relieved. One committee member actually smiled. Mr. K looked boxed in again. He said he'd consider the proposal. I asked if he'd commit to a trial period starting with the next policy draft. I asked for a vote. Board meetings are funny. They love to vote on tiny things when it suits them, but when a vote would lock them into transparency, suddenly everything needs further evaluation. This time, though, he couldn't dodge. Not with 30 residents watching. So he agreed to a 3-month trial of a resident volunteer panel, with sign-ups opening immediately. The room did that soft cheer thing people do when they don't want to be rowdy but are still thrilled. It felt like a gate opening. Then we moved to complaint accountability. I didn't mention Ms. D by name. I didn't need to. I just suggested that when a rule change or pause is triggered by concentrated complaints from one source, the committee should disclose that pattern so residents understand whether there's broad concern or a single anxiety-driving behavior. Mr. K stiffened, because he knew what I was pointing at. Ms. D stiffened even harder. He said complaints are confidential. I said sources can remain confidential while patterns are disclosed. I said it protects both residents and the board from misinterpretation. The treasurer nodded slowly. He understood. A committee can be led by legitimate concerns or by the loudest person in the room, and the building deserves to know which it is. They agreed to add a complaint concentration note to future bulletins. It was a small but powerful policy tweak. Ms. D's cheeks flushed. I could see it even from the table. It wasn't rage. It was shock. She was used to being a hidden lever. The meeting just installed a lock on that lever. And I realized the climax wasn't going to be some dramatic mic drop. The climax was this Seabreeze Tower choosing process over panic. The meeting drifted into some minor side items after that, but the core was done. By 7:30, the room had shifted in a way it hadn't in years. People were exchanging numbers. They were talking about volunteering. They were talking about reviewing other policies. The board was still in place, but its posture had changed from ruler to servant, at least for now. And Ms. D? She left early, notebook tucked tight, shoulders rigid. I watched her go without triumph. Just a quiet, settled feeling that her era of unchecked influence had ended. The day after the special meeting, the board posted official minutes with every commitment listed clearly. They also posted a retraction of the verification fee notice, promising any future fee changes would go through open vote. Volunteer panel sign-ups went live. Within hours, the list had more names than slots. The building's energy was different in a way that felt earned. Elevators were warmer. Neighbors were chatty. Even the rooftop garden had more people in it, like folks were suddenly less afraid to occupy their own space. I'd like to say the board was suddenly reformed and considerate. They weren't. But they were restrained. And restraint is half the battle in a place where rules can be used like nets. Ms. D didn't file another complaint about my solar panels. She still watched from her balcony sometimes, but her stare had turned from hunting to sulking. One afternoon I passed her in the hallway and she looked through me like I was scenery. I let her. I didn't need her approval. I didn't need her acknowledgement. I just needed her to stop running the building through fear. The treasurer emailed me a few days later to say the board had scheduled a training session on solar standards with an outside expert. Not to scold residents, just to set clear guidelines for future apps. If that had happened from the start, we would have avoided this entire mess. I replied that I appreciated the step and hoped they'd apply the same diligence to other policies too. Things didn't magically become perfect. There were still rules and friction and the normal condo stuff. But people now knew how to push when something felt wrong. The petition clause wasn't a myth anymore. The board knew residents read policy now. And I could feel Mr. K's power loosen. He wasn't cornered yet, but he was on notice. A president who learns residents can organize tends to either calm down or burn out. The funniest part was how quickly Seabreeze started leaning into solar in its marketing again. 2 weeks later, the lobby newsletter had a little blurb about embracing innovative energy solutions and celebrating resident sustainability. It had a photo of the building at sunset with an artsy glow. No mention of the war that made that blurb possible. That's fine. Let them save face. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about a boundary. On my end, the panels did what panels do. Every day, they quietly cut my electricity use. My summer bills were down. The app made me weirdly happy with its boring charts. Standing out on my balcony with the sun on the railing and the ocean rolling beneath felt like reclaiming something simple, The right to improve my home without being treated like a threat. The theme through all of it, if I had to put words on it, was autonomy. A community should protect shared spaces, not control private lives. Boards forget that when they get too comfortable. We reminded them.